Well, I didn't have a photo showing anything looking down from Murray Hill, and if I did, it would be useless because you wouldn't see Murray Hill. This is the Bell Labs complex in Murray Hill. Photo is obviously an aerial photo taken in 1959, which is in the midst of the period of many of the events that I'm going to be talking about tonight. It's a complex of buildings that grew over the years to roughly this configuration and then grew still further past then. There's a whole new front end that's built in the 1990s. But this is what people, if you ask people, where's Bell Labs? This is what they'll say, Murray Hill. And with good reason, it's the most famous facility. Since the 1960s, it's been the headquarters of Bell Labs. But at no time, it was the beginnings of Bell Labs, nor was it at any time the only facility, the only major facility of Bell Labs. Few of you might know this building. This is the Bell Labs facility in Holmdel, New Jersey, built in the late 50s and early 60s. At its peak, it housed over 6,000 researchers. Surely another major center. Similarly, there were centers in other places of New Jersey, in Whippany, chiefly for government research, in Middletown, in Long Branch, out in the Midwest, in Indian Hill, west of Chicago. But Bell Labs is not just Murray Hill. So in a sense, but since the headquarters is in Murray Hill since the 60s, one could say the view from Murray Hill encompasses everything that went on. Now, I promised you 6 innovations. Here's 6 innovations. I'll talk about all of these. But it's kind of 6 is an arbitrary number. There's lots of important innovations that aren't on this list. But, you know, how many can I talk about in a given period of time? And these are also related to the transistor, the solar cell, communication satellites, electronic switching, information theory, digital transmission systems. They're not quite in chronological order because thematically that's the order I want to talk about them. Now, as I said, Bell Labs did not begin in Murray Hill. So to tell the story, to place it in context, I don't want to begin in Murray Hill. There's a lot of stuff a lot of innovations that happened before Bell Labs ever got to New Jersey. And again, an arbitrary list of 6. I mean, the telephone itself. So one could say that obviously has to predate Bell Labs, but then it was Bell who did it, so I guess he could. There's some just with metallic circuits, loading coils, the high vacuum tube amplifier, electrical sound recording, broadband cable. The history of innovation goes through deep in the company's veins, going back to the company's founding. And that's what part of what I want to talk about. I mean, I could just talk about 6 innovations. Gee, these are neat. Gee, these led to these things. But I want to put them together in a coherent picture to explain how the innovations interact and fit in with each other, the goals, and how they fit into a corporate culture that encouraged and nurtured innovation. As most of you probably know, for most of its history, and certainly for the period that I'm talking about for the most part, AT&T was the national telephone monopoly, the parent company of the Bell system, local operating companies covering most of the United States, a manufacturing arm, the Western Electric Company, AT&T long lines, and what were called the general departments, which were the holding company. And monopoly, there's a cliche that monopolies aren't innovative, but like lots of cliches, it's really not necessarily true. One can find monopolies that were not innovative, but certainly not this case. So let's start at the beginning. This is Alexander Graham Bell as he looked like in 1876 when he invented the telephone. And this is Alexander Graham Bell's original patent for the telephone. It's one of the prized possessions at the AT&T archives. That is the actual patent with the actual lead seal. Always gave me goosebumps to take it out of the vault and show it to people. It's been called the most valuable patent in the history of the United States. I don't know if that's true, but it's probably not too far off. Bell invented the telephone at the age of 29. He retired at the age of 31. That's nice work if you can get it. Basically, unlike Edison, and I don't know, some of you who were here might have been here and heard Paul talk last week, Bell had no interest whatsoever in being a businessman. He set up a company with 2 financial backers to exploit his invention even before he made it, if he succeeded in inventing. And in 1878, he sailed off to England on a 6-month honeymoon and never worked another day in his life. But that's okay. He's lived a happy, rich, full life, and at this point, he'll leave our story, except in name. The company, the original Bell Telephone Company, founded in his name, they operated what we'd call franchising. That is, they held the patents and they licensed local businessmen in towns all across America to operate local telephone exchanges under the Bell patents. First one opens in 1878 in New Haven, Connecticut. By the early 1880s, there are telephone exchanges in just about every decent-sized city in the United States. Not too long after that, and you can find this in a statement that Bell made himself, visionary statement in 1878, the thought crossed the leaders of the company's mind that it would be nice to be able to connect the exchanges so people could talk longer distances. 1881, 5 years after the invention, the first experimental but commercial long-distance line opens up between Boston and Providence. It worked really badly. The background noise was so pronounced that you essentially couldn't hear the conversation. They were going to shut it down, but before they did, a young engineer named John J. Carty did an experiment. All the telephone lines at the time, taking on the model of the telegraph lines, were a wire and a ground return. Carty said, what happens if I use 2 wires, do a complete metallic circuit? Hey, the interference, the noise went way down, and you could now have an intelligible conversation over a business. So 5 years after the telephone is invented, there's a major innovation that comes from within the company. 1885, the name American Telephone and Telegraph Company first appears as a subsidiary of the then parent American Bell Company. It's chartered to build and operate the original intercity long-distance network. And it starts building out from New York City, from the nation's financial capital, in every direction, reaching Chicago in 1892, the nation's second largest city. This is the cover of a lovely advertising brochure that the company put out. And they put out a new one every 6 months. The other side's a map showing where the lines went. And as they kept building out, the map grew and they issued a new one. I love the advertising slogan in the center. The mail is quick, the telegraph is quicker, but long-distance telephone is instantaneous and you don't have to wait for an answer. It's fundamentally different from anything came before. It's, as we would say, the telephone is an interactive device. You have a conversation. 1894, Bell's patents expired. With the expiration of Bell's patents, anybody could open a telephone company, and anybody did. Over 6,000 local telephone companies opened up over the next decade. In some cases, these were serving areas that, during the monopoly era, no telephone service was available, most of rural America. In some cases, there were a group of farmers would band together and string wires between their farms. And in some cases, there was competing telephone companies. Now, the problem was they weren't interconnected. So if you subscribed to the home telephone company, I subscribed to the Bell Telephone Company, we couldn't talk to each other. In 1907, Theodore Vail becomes the president. By now, AT&T is the parent company. It was a corporate reorganization. Theodore Vail, who had been around from 1878 to 1887 as general manager, which roughly would translate in our terms as COO, his number 2 man left. He came back 20 years later, and he's the most important business leader in the history of the company. He really builds on what came before, produces the company that pretty much existed up until the end of the Bell system in 1984. He's a visionary both for the company and for the telephone. And one little piece is this. What is he looking for? The value of a telephone system is measured by the possibility of reaching through its connections anyone at any possible place. Now, at this point, it was impossible to, all the telephones were not connected. Not only were there independents, but not even all of the Bell system companies across the country were connected. At this point, you started out building thick open wires. You could reach about 1,000 miles. In 1899, one of those on the list of the second 6 innovations, loading coils, invented independently by George Campbell at AT&T and Michael Pupin at Columbia. AT&T bought Pupin's patents rather than trying to fight priority. Loading coils reduce attenuation, properly spaced according to the theory worked out by these two men, which means that the signal weakens at a slower rate and you can reach farther. With an plain open wire, you can reach about 1,000 miles. With loading coils, you can reach about 2,000 miles, roughly New York to Denver. Of course, you want to connect the continent, you need to go 3,000 miles, but they couldn't do that. And Vail's philosophy, it's multi-sided, was summed up in this advertisement. This is the first national advertisement placed by AT&T in 1980. One policy, one system, universal service. It should be uniform. Basically, he's arguing several things at once. And it's very clever. He's arguing that the telephone, by the nature of its technology, should be in one system. That all of these competing companies make no economic sense for the company. There should be one system, and of course it should be AT&T's system. He's the president of AT&T. And the policies, therefore, should be uniform across all the country's telephones, and the goal is universal service. Now, universal service means a whole lot of interlocking things to Vail. One, it means that all telephones should be connected in the one system. And that wasn't true. The second thing it meant was the telephone should go everywhere. And that wasn't quite yet true. The third thing it meant is that everybody should have access to the telephone. And access isn't the same thing as having a telephone. That could mean having access to a payphone in a neighborhood store. And the fourth and final thing, and what becomes eventually the dominant thing, is the ultimate goal is that everybody should have a telephone. Now, he's doing two things. One is he's setting a vision for the company. The second thing, he's trying to sell a bill of goods to the United States. The bill of goods he's trying to sell is that competition is the all-American way to deal and keep business fair and honest. But the telephone, that won't work because of the nature of the technology. It's a network technology. The value of your telephone is dependent on how many people you can talk to. There's another AT&T ad says, one telephone dumb, 5 million telephones eloquent. He said it's a natural monopoly because competition is not an efficient way of dealing with the telephone industry. It should be regulated by the federal government. But meanwhile, he's fighting against these independent companies. And one of the big advantages for AT&T is that it is a system. The independent companies are 6,000 companies, and they can try to do cooperative ventures to connect their exchanges, but joint ventures don't ever work as well as one company. Now, Vail saw the interstate long-distance network as one of the key advantages he had over the independents. He knew, and he pushed this, he publicized it, and it was partly a publicity tool. The call volumes, when Chicago-New York service opened up in 1892, it was $9 for the first 5 minutes. You know, it was not a high-volume business, but it was a prestigious business, wealthy people, and something so. Now, Vail knew that the problem was the technology only let him go 2,000 miles. His chief engineer is the same John J. Carty who did metallic circuit, who's now risen up the ranks to be the top technical officer of the corporation, knows what's needed. What's needed is a way to amplify electrical signals. There's no way that existed to amplify electrical signals. And Carty and Vail raised the stakes by putting the company's prestige publicly on the line, announcing in San Francisco in 1908 that AT&T would have transcontinental telephone service available in time with the completion of the Panama Canal, which was under construction. Carty knew what he had to do. What was needed was a way to amplify the electrical signals. So what Carty did, or one of his chief lieutenants, Dr. Frank Jewett, was go to the top physicist in the United States, a man named Robert Millikan at the University of Chicago, and said, send me a bright young PhD to work on the problem. And this is the guy he sent, Dr. Harold Arnold. Arnold started working on it in 1910. Also, AT&T let out the word through all the relevant community of electrical engineers and tinkerers and inventors that AT&T was looking for a way to amplify the electrical signal and would pay handsomely to anyone who had one that he would be interested in selling to the company. In late 1911, an independent inventor named Lee DeForest, who some of you probably have heard of, brought his invention, the Audion, first three-element vacuum tube, to AT&T. He was using it primarily as a detector of radio waves. It would give off a little bit of amplification. If you tried to give a lot of amplification, it would give off a blue haze and the whole system would collapse. Arnold takes one look at it and by the next morning figures out what's going on and how to make it work as an amplifier. What Arnold knew, Arnold being a fresh PhD and up on the latest theory, knew about electrons. DeForest, who took his PhD a decade earlier and apparently hadn't really kept up with the literature, did not. So he said, what you've got there is an ionization effect of the residual gases in the tube. All we need to do is increase the vacuum, and we'll have a working amplifier. And he did. And on the right is Arnold's invention, the high vacuum tube amplifier. So that's the winter of 1912. By summer, fall of 1912, they're testing the high vacuum tube amplifiers in circuits. They work just fine to amplify the signal. They start, and by 1913, they start building out the Transcontinental line going west from Denver, and another construction crew going east from California, from Sacramento, because there was a separate network on the West Coast. And in January of 1915, the Transcontinental telephone line opens up for service with great ceremonies from New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. The telephone unites the nation. One sense of universal service is achieved. Of course, at $20.70 for the first 3 minutes, people were not waiting in long lines to make calls. Now, the lessons... This is a photo of the crew, where the crews working east and west met in the summer of 1914 while constructing the line at Wendover on the Utah-Nevada line. But the lesson that the company learned from this was that bringing innovation in-house was a good business strategy. What did they do? They had a problem. They saw it as a scientific problem. They hired a scientist. He solved the problem. Aha, bringing R&D in-house is a good idea. It becomes institutionalized. From this, it becomes part of the corporate law. Now, Arnold had been working in what was called the Western Electric Engineering Department, which was roughly the R&D department of the manufacturing subsidiary. The success of that led to growing stature for R&D, and in 1925, Bell Telephone Laboratories was set up as a separate subsidiary of the corporation. And it was headquartered in what had been an old Western Electric building at 463 West Street, New York. That's a picture of Bell Labs. So Bell Labs starts in New York City, in a building that had been used for development, for some manufacturing, for warehousing, for offices, for a whole bunch of different things. Now, the other part of the story, if you remember, was Vail was trying to convince the United States government to accept AT&T as a monopoly. That happens too. This is a document called the Kingsbury Commitment, after the AT&T vice president who negotiated it with the Attorney General. It's a compromise. AT&T agreed to allow the non-competing independent companies to connect to its long-distance network. It agreed to stop acquiring independent companies without express permission of the federal government. And it agreed to divest its control of the Western Union, of the major telegraph company, which it had acquired in 1910. But what it does do is accept that American policy, as agreed upon with AT&T, is that the telephone would be a natural monopoly, and it sets the limits of the monopoly. And it's this document which forms the basic structure of the American telephone industry up until the breakup of the Bell system in 1984. Now, part of the commitment implied in that is that in return for the acceptance of the monopoly, AT&T would strive towards universal service, would strive to provide the best telephone service in the world. The culture that develops out of this is a real service-oriented culture. And universal service comes by the late 20s to pretty much mean that the ultimate goal of the company is that everyone should have a telephone and be able to call anyone else. As summed up in 1928 by Walter Gifford, who amazingly was president of AT&T, which is CEO, from 1925 to 1948. 23 years. We found ourselves, after recovering from the interruptions of the World War, once more on the track so we could go on about our business, which is furnishing telephone service to the people of this country. I did a lot of thinking as to where we were to go from here. It seemed to me that on the technical side of the business, okay, that's the stuff coming out of Bell Labs, we hadn't anywhere near reached the limit of what we could do. If we were to look forward and try to picture the technical millennium, it might be something like this. You would be able to pick up a telephone and talk to anybody anywhere just as quickly as you can talk to anyone across the street by telephone today, and do it for a very reasonable cost. And one more quote from Gifford a decade later, 1939, "We pioneered again in having research and development carried on in a central organization. This ensured progress in spite of the fact that competition in the usual sense of the word, such competition which is assumed to be essential to progress, has been largely absent." So we here have the goals. This is deeply ingrained in the culture of everyone in the Bell system, of achieving universal service, cheap, affordable universal service through R&D. Now, how does Bell Labs get to New Jersey? In part of the answer is it was there a long time before Murray Hill. There was some kinds of research that even back in the 20s didn't work in New York, particularly radio research. Too much interference, too many tall buildings to bounce signals off. So AT&T set up radio research stations in Holmdel and Whippany in the 1920s. This is probably the most famous thing to come out of them. And this is Carl Jansky in Holmdel, New Jersey in 1930. Carl Jansky invented the science of radio astronomy. Though he died young and he didn't become famous, and he only became famous posthumously. But he's doing this at Bell Labs in Holmdel in 1930. AT&T first thought about building a major facility in New Jersey in the early 1930s. The piece of land where Bell Labs sits in Murray Hill was purchased by AT&T in 1931. Plans to expand there. Of course, 1931, the Depression was pretty darn severe and getting worse. So nothing happened for the better part of a decade. The land sat empty. Indeed, for much of this period, Bell Labs had from 1932 to 1936, Bell Labs not only had a hiring freeze, but in order to avoid laying anyone off, put everybody on 4/5 time. Of course, for all these scientists, that didn't mean they showed up at the labs any less. So it worked real well. But they kept it together. A bunch of reasons why AT&T started moving to New Jersey. Now, at first, the intent wasn't to close 463 West Street and move everyone to Murray Hill, though that indeed is what happened in the 50s as the 50s and 60s went on. But there are a variety of reasons. One is they needed more space. Two, they wanted the opportunity for a purpose-built facility. And that was an old facility. Here they could run whatever gases they needed for chemical work, pipe through the building, because they could build a building just to suit their purposes. Third, it turned out by now then an awful lot of the scientists were living in New Jersey, and as lots of people in New Jersey do today, commuting into New York every day. So there was a lot of people who were simply interested in moving in New Jersey. The first portion of Murray Hill, this is what we're looking at here, opens up in late November 1941. That is a few weeks before Pearl Harbor. And the building expands over the years. We can go back to, here's 59. This picture is probably taken just after World War II. There certainly was no construction during World War II. Now, that gives us some background. And now here's the same list I showed you back at the beginning of the talk, the 6 innovations. Now I'm ready to talk about the 6 innovations. Let's start off with the most famous invention in the history of Bell Labs, the transistor, the foundation of all modern electronics, solid-state replacement for the relay and the vacuum tube. So 1948 publicity photo of the 3 people who were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1956 for the transistor, John Bardeen, William Shockley, his boss, and Walter Brattain. Bratton's the experimental physicist, the other 2 guys are theoreticians, in 1948. Now, the project, and this is one of the things that being an innovative monopoly allows you to do, it allows you to have a really long time scale in research. You're not worried about, what your competitor is going to come up with next if there's no competitors. The origins of the line of research that leads to the transistor starts in about 1936. Mervyn Kelly, who was the vice president for research, there are a lot of people at Bell Labs doing development, trying to invent improved telephones and things like that. But he was in charge of research. He was talking about people doing all the pie-in-the-sky stuff. That what we need is a program in solid-state physics. We think of the transistor as the replacement for the vacuum tube. What Kelly was after was a replacement for the hundreds of thousands, millions of clacking electromechanical relays that made up all the telephone switches. If we can just replace that with a solid-state device, a solid-state switch, we could achieve enormous increases in reliability. Moving parts wear out. Speed and complexity. There were already some people working in this area, notably Russell Lowell had been there through the 20s, who invented the PN junction diode in 40 and the first primitive silicon solar cell in 41. It said that there were only about 3 people at Bell Labs who could understand Russell Lowell's work, Shockley and Bardeen being 2 of them. Lowell's a kind of funny character. Lowell hated to write. And that's why one reason he is not well known at all. Bell Labs encouraged its scientists to participate in the overall scientific community, to publish. They had a full-scale scientific journal, the Bell System Technical Journal. You couldn't get him to write a memorandum. But if you were in the labs and you talked to him, this guy was flat-out brilliant. Kelly hires Shockley in 36 to begin working on it. The other 2 men come a bit later. Everything stops for World War II. Everyone is now working on projects of direct interest to the military, and some of it's related. After World War II in 45, the work picks up, and on December 16, 1947, Bardeen and Brattain succeed in amplifying an electrical signal with this device, the first point contact transistor. The first transistor event working in any kind is a point contact transistor. On December 24th, they show it off to everyone all the way up the line from them in the lab, from Shockley up to Ralph Mound, who had succeeded Kelly as vice president for research. And they did it in the most practical way. So you're doing this pie-in-the-sky stuff. So you remember what you're doing. They put a loudspeaker and a microphone in the circuit with the first transistor and turned it on and off, took it in and out of the circuit, and everyone in the room could hear the amplification. Well, you've got one experimental device. The The path from one experimental device to something you can manufacture is long and complicated, and if I spent much time talking about it, I wouldn't get to the other 5 innovations. But things like zone refining, to be able to produce silicon, germanium with the right kinds of extremely pure, so then you could dope them, put in the right types of impurities to make them P or N carriers, being able to produce it not just one at a time, but at least a semi-industrial scale. The first uses of the transistors were largely military uses, but now the Cold War's going, where the cost wasn't the issue compared to just being able to get something light and reliable, you know, a small analog computer you could put on a plane to serve as a gun director. AT&T freely licensed the transistors, had symposiums in 51 and 52 to other companies who wanted to learn about how to use the transistor. The first use in the Bell system itself was something called a card translator in the mid-1950s, which was used in the long-distance network to translate telephone numbers into routing codes. And this is what made the transistor famous. I put this up this is the first transistor radio. Regency transistor radio put up by some small company in Indianapolis in 1954. Notice this is not Sony. Sony did not have, I mean, Sony may have made the transistor radio the big thing, but they didn't come up with the first one. Sony wasn't even among the first 100 licenses. We have a list at the AT&T archives of the first 100 licensees for the transistor, and there are no Japanese companies on the list. English companies, other European companies, and no Asian companies. And what the transistor has led to is amazing. Yes, it replaced in many things the vacuum tube. It's more reliable. It doesn't give off the heat. It doesn't have to periodically, doesn't wear out, periodically be replaced. And the successor to the transistor, the integrated circuit, putting multiple of these solid-state devices on a chip, on one chip, you know, that underlies just about everything, a computer, cell phone, most of modern civilization, I suppose. Invention 2, related, the solar cell. Okay, Russell Lowell developed a crude solar cell, the first silicon solar cell in the 1940s. Efficiency rate less than 1%. It still was many times greater than the older selenium cells, which go back to the 19th century. These three men, Gerald Pearson, Darrell Chapman, and Calvin Fuller, came up with the first one that was really practical. They did two things. One, they increased the efficiency to 6%. Secondly, they figured out how to string a bunch of solar cells together into a solar battery to get a more useful quantity of electricity. And here's one of the first experiments with the solar cell. This is on the lawn of Murray Hill in 54. And one of the engineers working with these three men is testing a solar cell-powered radio transmitter. No doubt a solid-state radio transmitter with transistors in it. And what he's holding in his right hand is a solar battery, which contains about 8 semicircular shaped solar cells. Now, it quickly came into use in 1955. It solved the problem that AT&T had, and that was how to power repeaters in rural territories far from any convenient source of electricity. I mean, they had to basically run people out with batteries periodically. And now this is the first rural solar-powered rural telephone line is installed in, of all places, Americus, Georgia, Jimmy Carter's hometown, in 1955. Now, solar cells lead to something else. Innovation number 3, communication satellites. This is John Pierce. He's holding a traveling wave tube invented by his colleague Rudolf Kaufner. Pierce did a lot of the development work. It's the first device that can, in a practical sense, amplify microwave frequencies. Pierce, the idea that one should be able to send communication signals off a satellite in space was first published by the science fiction writer Arthur Clarke in 1945. Pierce in 1954, Pierce, not coincidentally, moonlighted under an alias as a science fiction writer, gave a talk saying yes, we can do it with the technology. He did the mathematics, and he said there are two ways to do it. One is a passive satellite, that's just a big balloon you can bounce the signals off of. And the other is what he called an active satellite. Would capture the signal, amplify it, redirect it, send it on. And he convinced AT&T to underwrite a project to do that. This, of course, accelerates after the Russians lost Sputniks in '57, and now not being behind the Russian becomes a matter of national honor. The passive satellite lost by NASA with AT&T in 1966 is Echo. They succeed in indeed bouncing phone conversations off Echo from the West Coast to the East Coast. But the big success, what they're working for 1962, was the first active communications satellite, Telstar. Telstar incorporates the traveling wave tube, the transistors, the solar cells. It's launched in July 10, 1962. There's a whole bunch of negotiations going on with NASA, who has the satellites to launch it, and AT&T, which has the idea, and they eventually come to an agreement. It's launched from Cape Canaveral in July of 1962. It is, because of the power limitations of the rockets available to NASA at the time, it's not in geosynchronous orbit, it's in a lower orbit. So there are windows when it's working, but it's meant to be an experiment. It's an enormous success. The ceremonial telephone call bounced off Telstar between Vice President Lyndon Johnson in Washington and AT&T President Frederick Capell, who's in Andover, Maine, which is where the U.S. ground station for Telstar was. There are two more ground stations put up. One by the British PTT, by the British telephone authorities in Cornwall, in the southwest corner of England, and another on the Atlantic coast of France. This makes possible the first transatlantic live television. And this is a screen capture of the first thing ever seen live across the ocean. This is the flag in front of the Andover ground station that domes the Andover ground station that was seen by people in France and England. There are all sorts of other things shown. The British sent a cooking show. The French sent Yves Montand. We sent a press conference by President Kennedy. It's an enormous experimental success. However, that summer, the United States government passed a law making satellite communications government monopoly, something called ComSat, and so AT&T drops out of the satellite business. And again, if you're looking at where this led to, now satellites have come and gone for telecommunications or even for data. Fiber optics, which I'll get to, is just a whole lot better and a whole lot cheaper. But even today, that's how television signals get around. You know, that's how your cable company picks up the 300 channels you can get in cable TV through satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Next one, electronic switching. This is a picture of the number one ESS, the electronic switching system. Number one, the first electronic telephone switch, special purpose computer, was installed in the local New Jersey Bell telephone office in Susquehanna in Morris County in 1965. Now, AT&T had been thinking about this for many years. Remember, this is why Mervyn Kelly started the line of research in the 1930s that led to the transistor. Took 30-some-odd years, but they got there. There's a whole line of tests. They're not while doing experiments, they're not waiting for transistors to get good enough. They start in the 50s largely with vacuum tubes, with various other sorts of similar devices, flying spot stores, barrier grid tubes, some of these maybe, but basically they're various special purpose vacuum tubes. First in the labs themselves, and by 1960, and this is kind of a hybrid system, it's got some solid state device and some evacuated glass in Morris, Illinois, which is a medium-sized city with not a lot of trunking problems, 1960 to 1962. One problem with this system is it didn't put out enough voltage to use conventional telephones. They had to have special telephones with transistor amplifiers in them. And that was a big problem because you can't They only did this once when they went from manual to dial switching. You know, to do that kind of change, you have to replace not just the switch, but everybody's telephone. This is not good. But this demonstrates the principles. It's also, even here you have the kind of, even in the Morse trial, you have some of the kind of things that are made possible by electronic switching, things like call waiting, call forwarding, three-way calling set up not by an operator but by you on the telephone. They go back to the Morse test. Three different electronic switches are developed. The one ESS, the commercial switch for central offices that we saw, a special 4-wire instead of 2-wire version for Cold War military systems. That's the photo here. This is the NORAD headquarters in Cheyenne Mountain outside of Colorado Springs, and a PBX. The interesting thing is that these switches, these are electronic switches, but these are analog switches. These are not digital switches. If you remember, the whole telephone network is analog this time. You know, you have analog signals, electrical analogs of the original sound waves. That's what's going down the wires. Even you add fax service, but what's happening at fax service? You convert the image to an analog signal. Even early computer communications, you convert, what's a modem do? It converts the digital signal of the computer into an analog signal. So the first generation switches were analog. The second generation switches, we'll talk a minute, it's kind of hard because things are going on in parallel to know what to talk about first, but the first use of digital transmission media in the system is in the long-distance network, not the local exchange. And as a result, AT&T pushes for the development of the first digital switch as a long-distance switch, not a local switch. It's not connected to your telephone, but to allow calls to get across the country. And the first electronic digital switch in the world, first number 4 ESS, electronic switching system, is installed in Chicago over the Christmas holidays in 75-76. Number 5, information theory. Now we're jumping back in time. Again, things are happening simultaneously. This is Claude Shannon. Information theory is the mathematical theoretical underpinnings that for just about everything the transistors made possible. Claude Shannon's an interesting character. Got it. In 1940, he earned both a Master's of Electrical Engineering and a PhD in physics from MIT. His master's thesis for his engineering degree looked to provide a mathematical understanding for the electromechanical switches of the telephone networks. And he did so by using Boolean algebra, by translating everything into ones and zeros. On the other hand, the other part of his project, the work he did for his physics degree, was working with Vannevar Bush on analog computing. He gets hired by Bell Labs, and so all this stuff is clearly very closely related to the telephone. He therefore, not surprising, gets hired by Bell Labs, goes to work for Bell Labs in 41, one of the early people to move into Murray Hill. He gets to work initially, now everything stops for the war, on analog computers, particularly fire control computers for anti-aircraft fire. But at the same time, he's still doing the mathematical work. He publishes a TM, an internal proprietary memorandum in 1944 called A Mathematical System of Cryptography. This is, in some senses, an early draft of his classic paper, which was finally published in 1948, A Mathematical Theory of Communications. Try to keep this brief and non-technical. I mean, this is a PhD mathematical physicist paper. But basically what he said is we can quantify information. And we can quantify it simply by the numbers of ones and zeros it takes to transmit the information, to capture the information. The content doesn't matter for our theory. And we can do this in bits per second. And this is the first public use of the term bit. And he said we can calculate the capacity of a channel the same way. And if our calculation gives us a smaller number for the information than for the channel, then we can successfully transmit the information. If the number is way too small, way smaller, then we know we're being inefficient. We have too big a pipe for what we need. And we also, further from that, can calculate the amount of noise that's permissible, the amount of nonsense before the signal is irrevocably corrupted. And we can also add extra digits so we can calculate and correct for the errors. This leads later to Hamming's work on error code correction. This is, we now, for the first time, there's a theoretical underpinning for all the stuff that the engineers have been doing in transmission and switching kind of by the seat of their pants. There are predecessors. You can find earlier work going back to the 20s in Bell Labs, people named Hartley and Nyquist. But this is where it all comes together. And now that we have this theory, it makes it possible to start developing digital transmission, because we now have an underlying digital theory of information, of information movement. And this is the last of my 6 innovations, and it's got 2 parts. PCM, pulse code modulation, what might be more familiar to some of you if I say sampling, digital sampling, was first devised. A guy at Bell Labs named Ramsey came up with it in 1926. Appears in a patent where he's trying to figure out how to come up with a technique to send faxes over telegraph lines. And telegraph lines are digital. Telegraph signals are on, off, on, off, on, off. It doesn't work, and his work becomes lost. Pulse code modulation, which is basically a technique to turn analog signals into digital, an analog wave into a digital representation, is rediscovered independently by a guy named Ramsey working for I.P.T.V, not AT&T, in Paris in 1937. Without the theory, there's not a whole lot they can do with it. And without transistors, there's not a whole lot to do with it. But where it was needed, it had one immediate use. PCM was one of the several components, voice synthesis was another, that was used by Bell Labs during World War II to devise something called SIG-SALLY. It was telephone conversations went across the ocean by radio waves. Radio waves can be intercepted by anyone, like the Germans. But using PCM and voice synthesis and records with one-time codes on them, they were able to develop a secure communication system so Roosevelt and Churchill could talk on the phone every day and not worry about the Germans. And if you go to Churchill's war rooms, which are a underground museum in London, you'll see this little closet, and it's where Churchill talked on the phone to Roosevelt. Now, what they don't show you is that the equipment that made it possible filled the entire basement of Selfridge's department store. Among other things, you're dealing with vacuum tubes. Okay. The first digital transmission systems appear in 1962 in Chicago. First commercial system installed in the phone network between Dearborn and Skokie, Illinois. And it was done, and this is the terminal. This is the terminal bank where the lines terminated in the Dearborn central office. Basically, what it was done was a digital signal sent over the existing medium. This is coaxial cable, invented in 1929. It was one of the inventions on that first list that I didn't talk about. It's the first broadband transmission media. They're sending digital signals instead of analog signals over it. Why? Because they're having problems in the cities with electrical interference on the analog signals. If they've got a digital signal, they eliminate the electron interference. It works. It becomes very widespread through the long-distance network. Now, there are 2 major transmission media in the long-distance network in this period. One's coax. The other's microwave relay towers. And by 1973 or so, probably at least half of the voice traffic within the network, that is not between the local station and the subscriber, are being sent by digital signal. But notice, it's digital signal used to improve the quality of voice transmission. In 1974, something called DUV, or data under voice, appears on the microwave systems. And that's long-distance pure digital transmission. Before then, computer transmissions were via modems. That is, it was converted to an analog signal first. Even if then it was converted to a digital signal to go over the long-distance network. That's part one of the story. But there are limits to the rates at which one can send digital signals over these existing mediums. So the real solution is to come up with a new medium. They were working on something called millimeter waveguide, which were hollow tubes to which millimeter wavelengths could be sent across the country. By the time that was ready, it got leapfrogged by fiber optics. And the story there is complicated. The ultra-pure glass fibers themselves are invented by Corning. Most of the laser development is at Bell Labs. It's rapid pulses of laser. The first installation goes in 1977 in Chicago, and the most famous early installation is the second one, Lake Placid, New York, in 1979. Basically, the Winter Olympics were coming there. This little town didn't have enough communications capacity for all the people who were going to descend to cover the networks, not just journalists, but TV as well. So AT&T tries to make this, decides that might as well make this a demonstration for the state-of-the-art technology. And that brings us to the end of my 6 innovations. Now, see how they fit together. They're all driven, even if some of the uses go quite far from the telephone, and even if they take decades to get from conception to reality. The Transistor research program begins in 36. The electronic switch, that's the goal of the program, comes in 65. It's all tied into this service ethos and to this drive to perfect the telephone network. So there's a guiding principle. It's not random. And there's a guiding culture that encourages all this, that encourages one to take the long view. Now, as we know, in 1984, result of an antitrust suit, the Bell system broke up, and this careful interlocking set of companies, of operations, splits into a whole variety of parts. And that's brought good and that's brought bad, but that's really another lecture. Thank you.